Welcome to The Exchange, the Metapolitics interview show with me, Cactus. And joining us today, we have Socialism Done Left. And I think no one can give a better introduction than yourself, so go ahead.
Sure, I'm Aiden. I run the channel called Socialism Done Left. I try to do like debates. I tend to do like long form arguments or talks with other people. I would say that I'm like a progressive socialist, like a market socialist. I want to see a world which is dominated by like workplace and economic democracy. And I think that today we're going to talk about rhetoric and persuasion and so on. So I think I have some, not perfect research, but some research in this background. So I'd love to talk about that topic.
Yeah, so I think what's very interesting to illustrate the media environment that we live in is actually something that I randomly stumbled upon and made a pretty serious judgmental mistake on. So femboys.
Oh, no.
I initially thought that it was actually a very far-right thing because of just various memes that have been posted on Twitter and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And
it's not only after like I stumbled upon your channel and then looking a bit further into it, why is there a socialist femboy if it's a right-wing trope? But really it's not. That's the magic trick that's been played here. Right, there's been a false association game that I even have in my mind when I'm not even paying attention, where you have these memes, you have this media that's constantly being shared, and just because you see two things together in one specific scenario gives you a completely false impression of what is actually existing in reality. And I think that's very much the effects that we're exploring on this show, Metapolitics. So, to give you an introduction on some of the deeper lore and terminology that we generally talk about on the show, there is generally idea of an information cliff. So a breaking point in which there's a takeover from the sort of quote-unquote rational methods of information exchange, logical arguments, evidence-based arguments, science, etc., to alternative methods. I like to use the phrase many ways into the house. You can think of interacting with an idea or gaining legitimacy, or having an idea gain legitimacy normally as the front door approach. But there are other approaches as well, including political coercion, such as in authoritarian countries or authoritarian-like countries like Hungary. You can have economic pressures be utilized for this as well, such as in mafia racketeering ring. And you can also have political pressure, even in a non-authoritarian way, being used in order to lean into this one way or the other through things like various economic policies subsidizing various industries. You have another method of bribery or of infiltration, most commonly known as having happened in the Cold War, but also used once again for economic interests, like with climate denialism and with specific studies being funded by various industries to express points that may not actually be scientifically rigorous. And finally, you have the third category, which is the most novel and also the most loosely defined, at least in my opinion, where you have various exploitations. You have manipulations of either psychological effects or of other self-perpetuating dynamics, things like confirmation bias, tribalism, etc., to gain prominence, to gain the widespread presence of an idea without it actually being connected to a solution, connected to predictive ideas, to anything that's actually beneficial to the people it's purported to help. And sorry if I'm talking a bit too long here, but I think it's important to establish kind of firm base on the core currencies that we're dealing with when it comes to thinking about information flow. And there are two other kind of ideas, these two currencies that I think are important to look at. The first is attention, which scales approximately linearly with a lot of media revenue models. So with subscription, with advertising for sure, and also to some degree with donation models as well, although that one has other factors playing into it. And you can see that what's novel about our new attention situation is that it's no longer limited by distribution. And what I mean by that is, oh, I'm sorry about that. There is historically a physical cap or other technological cap, such as printing newspapers, or even the time it takes to get someone to watch television, where you have a limiting principle on the actual amount of attention that can be leveraged at any given point in time outside of a person's own choice, right? And that's very much gone out the window with the advent of the internet, and particularly with the advent of social media. And you see a very strange, almost relativistic behavior with regards to, of course, movement approaching the speed of light, where at the same idea, where you have information approaching the amount of information, the maximum amount of information that a single person can handle, where you get incredibly strange psychological behavior here. And the other currency is trust, where you have trust that's been parasitized by this attention economy, whereas in the past you had trust established through processes, through careful documentation, and the identification of evidence. You end up now with what is essentially a political and marketing tool for trust, for it to be essentially used as a branding mechanism by various quote-unquote fact-checking organizations such as factcheck.org or PolitiFact that actually have lower standards of investigative journalism or verification compared to something like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, regardless of what you think of those institutions themselves. So what that means is that, and this is something we can talk about later, but I'm not going to expand on right now, because of the culture of kind of faux quote-unquote accountability in Western countries in particular, where there needs to be this sort of security theater every time there exists a mistake, right? Instead of actually relying on the good faith and the process of these journalistic institutions, the thing that actually happens is that they outsource this. Every time there's a problem, they say, oh, we're going to get this other organization to look into it, when that organization has lower standards and also is essentially a branding organization that specifically tries to leverage this this aura of trust with regards to the practical or with regards to the appearance of action being done. So what all of this kind of crystallizes in real life, and I think there's fair documentation of this, is a real divergence in left-wing policy. And I think here's where I want to definitely get your opinion on how this is played out, particularly in left-wing communities themselves, where you have a media control that on one side strongly promotes culturally left policies, while also attacking, sometimes with poorly done and bad faith attacks on more economically progressive policies. So where do you see that playing out, and how do you see the kind of movement to try to change this within more left-wing channels?
Sure. I mean, so that's quite a theory, first off, and I agree with a lot of the parts of it. On the specific question of like why we see, say, certain patterns in, say, like MSNBC, for example, which is like a mainstream news network, why it often takes very socially left positions, but why it often rejects economic left positions. I think that it really comes down to incentives. And so fundamentally, the incentive of all news organizations is to maximize profit. But owners of news organizations also have political goals as well, because they are the owners often of capital, and they want to obtain a return on capital in the future, not just in the present. So the profit incentive, I think, very clearly explains why you constantly see even MSNBC, even like these mainstream news journalistic agencies running clickbait. They just want to get clicks. They want to run negative stories that get people involved. That's why if it bleeds, it leads. All of these are very easily explained by the profit incentive. But I think in addition, it's easy to understand why even MSNBC, which caters to like a left liberal or leftist part of the Democratic Party, would reject economic left policies because the owners of that capital might feel that it threatens them, and so they would like not to advocate for policies which would reduce their profit. So in short, I think that the simple answer for both those ultimately boils down to an incentive to seek profit. And so to fully finish the analogy, it'd be that left-wing economic policy threatens profit return for the owner of, say, MSNBC, but social left policy doesn't threaten their profitability, right? If gays exist, it doesn't mean that MSNBC is less profitable. If anything, it might mean more of a viewer base. But like more capital gains taxes, more like wealth taxes, those do mean less profitability pretty directly.
Absolutely. And I think that what you've seen as well is you have policies, particularly if you look at the differences between the United States and other countries, you have policies that are also relatively popular in the United States or just popular on like absolute values, and also that are implemented in other countries, things like single-payer healthcare, things like minimum wage, things like higher union participation, that are much more that have a kind of connection to people on the ground whenever polling is done. I mean, of course, polling is undergoing quite a situation right now, but I think there's still an understanding that it probably isn't off by too much when you have rates like 70, 80% approval for many of these policies that are not necessarily filtering down to the actual political level. So
on that
how do you
note,
think?
Sorry, fully finish your question. My bad.
How do you see that? How do you see that crystallizing in the sort of left movement, and what direction you can chart from there?
Well, so I think that on that, there are two really interesting theories that I think are relevant to the question of why certain economic left policies are popular, and that doesn't result in economic left policies actually being adopted. So the first answer is that they aren't actually popular. And I don't think that that's very generally true. I think, as you say, that polling is reasonably accurate. We have reason to believe that even so, for example, some people cite very favorable polls on Medicare for all, but even when you get like less favorable polls on Medicare for all and you couch it in like negative language. So, for example, the Kaiser Family Foundation, I believe, did polls saying, hey, would you support a single payer healthcare system where private insurance is banned and everyone is employed by the.
It was still like 50% support. But obviously, economic like health care policy is nowhere close to Medicare for all in the United States. Public option, even under similar conditions, polls extremely highly. So what's the gap there? And I think the two answers come, one, from the idea of saliency, which is something that I think if you want someone to look into, it would be David Shor, S-H-O-R. He argues that over time, social issues have become enormously more salient in the American populace, and economic issues have become less salient. What that means is that the average person, when they're thinking of who to vote for, what's sticking out in their mind, what is salient, is social stuff. They vote Republican because they don't like immigrants. They vote Democrat because they love gays. They aren't voting based on economic policy. And so this has actually been, to some degree, one of the reasons why the Democratic Party and the left in general in Europe has suffered. People have started voting based on social issues, which the left social positions are like 50-50 with the right social positions, but the economic positions of the left are often substantially more popular. An example of this that I point to is in 2020 in Florida, Trump won the state by 53%, right? So slight majority. Florida also passed a $15 minimum wage with 60% approval, and yet they didn't vote for the guy who wanted the $15 minimum wage. What's up with that? I think the basic answer is that issue is salient when you put it to them in a direct question, but it's not salient when you're voting for a politician in general. You're mostly thinking about social issues there. And the second issue, and I think this one is much simpler, I won't go into too much detail, is I think it should be obvious from a variety of empirical evidence and just from living here that the United States is not a full, true, 100% fair, one vote, one person, equal influence sort of democracy. It is, the relevant term is called biased majoritarian institution. Wealthier people tend to have more power, and wealthier people tend not to like these positions as much. This is not to say that the United States is not a democracy, just simply that those who have more wealth tend to have more influence over policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's done by things like loose campaign finance laws, advertising, fundraising, etc. And I think the question is, though, do you see this being overcome? Do you see this being changed by left politicians? And if so, how?
Well, I think that one of the big successes, one of the reasons why Sanders was so successful, despite if you look at his campaign, the things he ran on were mostly not social policy. And almost everything that people remember Sanders for was economic policy. And so one of the reasons he was able to run successfully is because he picked popular, salient economic issues like healthcare and ran with them. I think that part of a successful Democratic future does include focusing on trying to make more salient where Democrats are popular on social issues and where Democrats are popular on economic issues. So one of the arguments that David Shore says, and I think this is a little bit controversial, is Democrats should try to talk a lot about areas where they are strong on social issues. So, for example, like gay marriage is very, very popular. A lot of Republicans, like Dave Perdue and Loeffler, they oppose gay marriage as of 2020, right? You should make those issues salient. Dave Perdue doesn't even think climate change is real. He's like, in general, just very, very conservative. So those issues make them salient. But his suggestion is also, therefore, you should not make some social issues salient. You might not want to talk about immigration, where more people almost seem to agree with the Republican Party thing. You might not want to talk about race, which sometimes seems to move people to the Republican Party. But that's a more complicated discussion. And there's arguments about turnout, and maybe talking about race, for example, might get black turnout. It might get the base of the party, the liberals, engaged again. And so that's a whole more complicated argument. But in short, I think the saliency argument is focus on where you're winning, and economic issues are one of those areas. You want to see candidates like AOC and Sanders talking about those economic issues because they are very popular. If Fox News has to do a whole segment talking about how bad the $15 minimum wage is, that's actually good because that will make that issue more salient in the minds of the populace. I'll finish with one last thing. There was a really neat article from the polling institution, left-leaning polling institution, which sometimes does polls. I don't like their wording sometimes, but polling institution called Data for Progress. And the article showed that a lot of Republicans don't know the economic positions of the Republican Party. 80% of Republicans think that their party wants to protect pre-existing conditions. 80%. 40% of Republicans, I think it's either 30 or 40%, think that the Republican Party wants a $15 minimum wage. How could you possibly believe this? The only answer is that these issues aren't in people's minds. They aren't hearing it from the media. And so, for better and worse, it is good to have these issues on people's minds. So I think just messaging-wise, focusing on these, making them as salient as we can, is an economic winning strategy. Sorry, not an economic, a politically winning strategy for the left.
Yeah. To push back on the minimum wage point, I think part of it, actually, I'm not sure if the $15 number is quite the same, but I think part of the more flexibility with regards to that is due to local versus federal politics, because a lot of the time you have local Republican leaders, particularly those in more blue states or in more purple states, that do lean into some of these elements, including increasing the minimum wage. And I think Larry Hogan is somewhat known for this. Governor of...
Are you also a Maryland resident?
I am not.
Well, I am, so I guess I know.
So I'm sure you know a bit more about that than me.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries. So I think the really interesting conversation to be had here is on the short-term versus long-term values of a lot of these kind of attention shifting ads or political strategies, because I've actually done a deep dive on this on one of the earlier episodes on my show, talking about, and I think this is something that you talked about as well, talking about the intersection of community with a lot of these fundamental principles, a lot of these weightings, and how you can use these issues to then leverage network effects, leverage communities to actually come together and to support a given party, support a given issue, given ideology, regardless of the kind of individual differences that I might have, as long as you can have something that's unifying. And I think some of the early preliminary data shows that one of the most effective ways to actually develop this long-term political loyalty is to have some of these network effects, is to have I forget which one of these polls it was, but I think one of the was it Fraser Institute? I don't know. There was a poll. I don't remember. I'm trying to come up with it now, having seen it for research, I think 2 or 3 months ago. But essentially, there was this poll talking about the likelihood to vote for one party or the other versus being consistently involved with a group with a majority of that party's members. So think of something like a church, a union, a sports club, etc., where you have the highest correlation not being with even your belief in issues or your belief in either a candidate or their own organizing, but instead in your community, your kind of pre-existing roots and your connections to the people you're kind of surrounded with, right?
No, I very strongly agree with this. If you would need to finish, go ahead. But I was just going to say a book I very much like on this is Politics is for Power by Hirsh. Basically, the whole thesis of the book is that local groups, like those you're talking about, local political organizations and non-political organizations, can have a tremendous ability to get people to vote and be politically active. And he argues that's key not only for getting people politically active, but for like maintaining a strong democracy and basically other important values. But I think Politics is for Power by Hirsh, really good book on the topic. Totally agree.
Yeah, I actually read through it 2 days ago and researched for the preparation for this podcast. And that's absolutely something I want to talk about. So the formulation of the book for my audience is essentially a 4-part series talking about what Hirsch terms political hobbyism, or essentially the idea of following politics without actually engaging with it, without actually trying to go out into the community and convince more people, without actually trying to build electoral power and organizational power.
I was just going to say, brief interjection. I was just going to say, I also like the term political cheerleading, which I heard from someone when they talked about that, because you're standing on the sidelines, but you're not playing in the game. Rah, rah, go Democrats.
Yeah. I think that's a good illustration of it, and then how that connects to local organizing and power. How having a greater amount of political hobbyism or political cheerleading instead of those on the ground efforts reduces a lot of the representational factors, and how this can actually be changed. How this power can sort of be redirected. And I think this does go back into the connection with these various social issues versus economic issues, where I think it's not only uncertain whether those issues will gain salience again, but whether they're actually going to be able to hold firm positions, to actually hold long-term organization with many of these social issues, as opposed to other possibly more local issues, more community-oriented issues. So what is your take on that, and both in the book and on in practice overall?
I mean, I love the book. I like books that a lot of empirics, mostly on his section about political cheerleading, less so on community organization. I felt, have you had a chance yet to do research about deep canvassing?
I've read the 2 studies that he cited in the book,
and those are great. Unfortunately, there isn't that much of a literature on it yet. So you have done, I think, I want to say that's like 50% of all the studies on it yet. So the basic idea of deep canvassing is extending this idea personal connections, and that shapes their political views, and taking that and scaling it up by having individual canvassers go out and talk with someone for about an hour about an issue. And so the famous one about this Not the famous fraudulent one, because that one was a fake. The famous one that was actually real was about trans rights. And so they had a trans person or a trans rights advocate, go out and talk to someone, I think in Florida, for an hour, half an hour to an hour, about trans rights. And they showed that, I want to say 6 months later, those people were like 8 to 10 points more in favor of like having trans people go to the same bathroom, having them have the same rights as all other citizens. And this was true even when you sent them a negative ad about trans people. So it suggests that these beliefs are deeply changed in the long term by personal connections. So I really like the research about deep canvassing. I think that's another important way to look at these things. It's that not only should we be talking about community organization, but as a political goal, if our goal is to get people to change their minds, we have an ability to do this not just by setting up long-term 60-year churches or whatever, which will preach the democratic gospel, but we can also just do this on the ground by having deep canvassing operations. The other really interesting theory is the contact hypothesis, which at its core just asserts that when people who are different have frequent contact with each other, they will tend to be less hostile to each other in the long run. And so we've seen lots of evidence with this, like white kids who go to black schools tend to be much less racist for simple reasons, I think. And similarly, we've seen that like highly integrated places with less racial division, like less segregation, tend to be much more tolerant. And so I think that one of the relevant theories for like why the gay rights movement has been so successful is that a lot of people know a gay person, or they know a person who knows a gay person. A lot of them even have them in their family. And so it's very easy to empathize with someone when you know someone of that type. And so one of the real breakdowns, Hirsh says, of modern politics is that we have seen the collapse of people going to church, which as like a strong atheist, I suppose I should be happy about. But we've also seen the huge decline of unions. We've seen the huge decline of local political organizations, local school, like sports organizations. All of it has started to fall apart. And Hirsh says he doesn't necessarily name the causes for it per se, but he does say this is really, really bad, in part because one of its effects are that people no longer have these personal connections. Fewer and fewer people know a Democrat or know a Republican in their friend group. Fewer and fewer people know a trans person, know someone outside their circle. And I guess the closing thing I'll say on this, and I know I've been going for a while, is there was a neat study, I want to say published a month ago or something, which showed that when you had Democrats and Republicans debate, like sit down and do a nice little semi-formal debate, both sides, both individuals were substantially more likely to believe that democracy can work and that the other side isn't fundamentally out to destroy democracy. So regardless of your beliefs about whether it is in fact true that one side is out to destroy democracy, it is true that just sitting people down will tend to make them come together and be able to cooperate more. So I think that's a really interesting and probably positive outcome of just rebuilding social connections.
Yeah, and I think just expanding on that, and also feel free to take however long you want. It's definitely incredibly interesting. I think, of course, this is political orthodoxy, but as some of the studies in the book also show, there's very much a tie to empathy, a tie to that human one-on-one connection when it comes to some of these organizational factors. And I really do feel like there's a split way of looking at this. Because on one hand, you can see it as essentially a circumvention of someone's interests, or an appeal to something that doesn't actually directly benefit people. On the other hand, you can see it as sort of community building on giving them sort of cross ideology understanding, which kind of lowers the temperature and reinforces some of that ability to get along with each other, to increase the connectivity within community. But how do you see this kind of playing out in terms of its effects on policy, not just with regards to parties, but not just with regards to who wins an election, but also with regards to what policies actually get adopted?
Well, and so I totally agree with the first note that this is somewhat that the impact of these community organizations can be totally it's like orthogonal to politics. Hirsh explicitly makes clear that any group can do this sort of political organization. He knows that even the KKK in some areas is doing this sort of community building stuff, and so then now people love the KKK because they give them food. And so being nice to people is not like a thing that only one side can do, for better and worse. I do totally agree with that. In terms of the policies that can get adopted out of this, I would tend to believe. So one of the things that Hirsh also shows in his book is that communities which are poorer and communities which face more political repression tend to already still have maintained a lot more of these organizational structures. So he notes that political organization is much stronger among blacks in the United States. It is much stronger among poor people in the United States, which sounds odd because rich people have more free time, they have more education, they know more about the political system, and they have the connections to make it possible. And yet poor people are the one who actually are much more likely to go out and march, participate in these organizations, and work together. So I suppose I should say that theoretically, if we just like had it now, everyone is organized. Weirdly enough, you might see politics slightly become more rich biased because rich people would have slightly more power. But I would tend to believe that you would also have an increase of empathy because ideally you would have people crossing community barriers, and no longer would rich people be siloed in rich communities, but they would get to know poor people. They would get to know the issues that impact those poor people. Because part of Hirsch's whole theory is that when you don't need to think about everyday issues, like what are often called like paycheck issues, how does a poor person survive? How do they get by? What is the impact of welfare in like a person's life? What is the impact of like basically if you don't see it, if you don't know someone who feels it, it is hard to empathize with it. And so I think that a more compassionate politics would tend to produce a politics which is more in favor of giving to those in need. Basically, again, on the theory of contact theory, just knowing poor people, just knowing people of other races should tend to make you more compassionate towards those perspectives, towards those experiences.
Yeah, I think the worry that just strikes me is that, and I'll get into a bit of the connection back to the convergence ideas earlier, but I think the greatest worry here is that you have dueling empathetic appeals. You have the empathetic appeal, of course, of, for example, a struggling undocumented immigrant, right? Of someone who's just trying to make it by, who's just trying to avoid like persecution by gang. But you also have like the one-off examples, and statistically this is unlikely, but you still have individual examples of, for example, people who were murdered by immigrants. And I'm not saying that this is an ingenuous or this is a honest kind of appeal, right? Because it is statistically lower percentage of that population than of the general population. But you do still see that you can kind of make an empathetic case for both sides, and this actually might reduce the salience of the reflection in real life of what consequences policies have. So what direction do you see empathy having in that kind of framing, in that kind of game of politics?
Well, and this is something, so I mentioned in the beginning that media has this sort of like, if it leads perspective. There was a really neat graph from Our World in Data, I think, about, I think if you just Google like Our World in Data, causes of death versus news coverage, you should get a graph that looks at this.
Oh,
and so
yes, terrorism 40%, 40 times,
yeah,
4,000%.
I
think that's the graph you're talking about, right?
Yes. No, like violent deaths make up, let's say 1% of like a death in the United States, but they make up, let's say, like 20% of the media coverage. I don't know the numbers offhand. I guess True has the stats on hand, but and I think that's due to the profitability angle, and that's because people like to read stuff. We have a whole lot of evidence that the kind of stuff that goes viral and the kind of stuff that is successful in news is that negativity stuff. So yeah. I think that I would tend to believe that community empathy would tend to be more based on raising people up in a way that it just isn't possible that is so different from the news. And the basic way to put it is like this: if you are in a community, there will be so many more people who are like people of a given race, of a given ethnicity, of a given like socioeconomic background, there will be so many more people like that telling that story than there will be victims of crime. And even those victims of crime, too, will often come from those backgrounds. And so I think the stories that you hear from individuals will be very different than what you see on the TV, which is going to focus on violence. It's going to focus on all the things that make people scared. And if there's one thing that we know, it's that when people think quickly, when they think scared, when they think anxious, it does seem to, in a variety of experimental studies, lead to more conservative thinking, more conservative policy proposals. So in general, I would tend to think that the empathy you'd get in groups would be more positive empathy than negative, which is what you see a lot in like news domination. Sorry. Did she leave, or did she just want attention number 2 or attention number 1? Attention.
No worries. Cats are like that.
That's really all I had to say. I think that it's hard to know offhand because Hirsh notes that a lot of the groups in the past, like the churches, the unions, the political organizations, a lot of them in the past were deeply racist and like sexist. He has like a whole, I want to say, chapter on like the racism and sexism of the Chicago political machine. And like unions were notorious for being somewhat anti-immigration because they perceived it as harming their wages, harming their interests. So I don't think it's like innately that it's gonna be this way. I think I hope that there's a general tendency towards more compassion, especially when you bring people of different backgrounds together. That's the basic take. I can still hear you, by the way.
Okay, great. So, yeah, there are a bunch of launching points I kind of want to go off of here. The first is, I think there can be, at least I've seen arguments for both sides of the immigration debate simply from an economic perspective, right? Of course, you have this strong appeal of empathy, but when it comes to the actual kind of cost-benefit analysis, I think there's been several studies that showed that, I mean, obviously, if it's based on racist beliefs, if it's based on like discriminatory views, and then it's not really a beneficial argument. But there have been studies kind of outside of that are completely unrelated, showing that there are economic consequences, particularly to lower wage or to quote unquote working class jobs of all races when you have a looser immigration standard. So do you think what do you think is the kind of room for development here when there are at least some claims of, or some scientific studies of actually showing a correlation between those factors?
I mean, I guess if we want to stay on communication, I won't get too far into the immigration debate. In general, I basically agree that it does seem like a reasonable amount of evidence does suggest that for the very low wage natives, and in particular for recent immigrants, there is a negative wage and negative employment effect of additional immigration. However, it's important to note that generally, virtually every study from every economist, other than a guy named George Borjas, any study by anyone other than Borjas, is going to find that immigration was still a net positive effect on wages and on employment in like a given area in a given country. And so I think that from a leftist perspective, I see these sorts of things as examples of economic good, distributional bad. And so the way that you solve an economic good but a distributional bad is with redistribution. You say, hey, this thing helps the economy, but it screws over some people, particularly the poor. We don't want to screw over the poor, so we're going to take some of the benefits of this new economic growth and we're going to shift it down over to the poor. Now, obviously, that's an incredibly complicated issue. You might be talking about unemployment in one area and having to move people to another area. There's a whole bunch of displacement that could be involved. I'm not going to claim it's going to be like simple, but it does seem like there's a lot of reasons to think that immigration overall has really actually quite large economic effects in the long run, particularly due to stuff like innovation and increases of like a domestic economic market. In short, I will send I will appeal to consensus a little bit, and I will also send you an article from a guy named No Opinion, which looks at a whole bunch of recent high quality and often meta-analysis articles about immigration to show more or less the same argument that I'm raising here from a guy named Noah Opinion. So
yeah, I think that's definitely a very solid response, and I think I should clarify that there are definitely studies that show the opposite as well, that show very strong benefits to immigration, particularly when it comes to not just the kind of lower wage categories. But I think really what has happened with immigration and comes down to the intersection of all of these factors, both the media biases and incentives that we talked about earlier, and also the kind of power of narrative that we're exploring now, is that you see a reaching of kind of social issue arguments into areas where they might not necessarily reside. And I think the most kind of damaging area where this is kind of reached is climate change, where you see very much emotional appeals, you see kind of demographic network effect kind of appeals as well. And I think it's kind of understandable. The narrative that I think best fits the fact pattern that you had is that you had scientists try to go at it the old-fashioned way, try to just educate the public essentially using well-done science, and you had takeovers by various corporate interests. You had bad faith advertising campaigns, and a lot of these demonization tactics, or a lot of these social tactics, first implemented by the right in terms of climate change, at least. And you've seen this equal and opposite reaction on the left. That's very much about building outrage, building anger, instead of actually addressing many of these actually very technical and very difficult and very open-ended questions with regards to climate policy. And I don't know, maybe this is just my kind of scientific background, but I'm someone who wants to seek a return to that more technical-based arguments, that more verification-based argument, right, of actually connecting the promises or the kind of moral values with actual work and policy that's done to affect the issues. And yeah, I think the puzzle I'm just trying to crack here, and I definitely want your advice on this, is how to restore that connection between moral values that may be definitely directed in a good direction, definitely like trying to do good, and how to actually connect that back to having solutions that do the best to benefit and do the best to make a good trade-off without kind of the extremism or the political hobbyism that happens with many of these issues.
So I haven't done, on global warming in particular, I haven't done too much research on messaging, so I can't speak very much that one in particular. So that one's out, I guess. But in general, I guess some of the evidence that I would point to is, so we know, for example, so like we were talking about the profit incentive, one of the simple things you can do to improve people's trust in institutions in general, and in the news process and in science, is apparently publicly funded media. And the reason seems, in my assumption is, the reason why is because publicly funded media doesn't have as strong of an incentive to pursue profit. It doesn't have as strong of an incentive to pursue, if it bleeds, it leads sort of stories. And so it leads to somewhat, not necessarily like perfect, obviously, but somewhat more objective news telling. There was a really neat study that I recently read, which showed that countries in Europe, which have more public broadcasting, have less right-wing extremism, and they have higher trust in the news process. I can probably find that. I can probably find that in a few moments, but just remind me and I'll grab it. And so I would note, like in virtually every country on Earth, publicly funded media is the highest trusted media. So I guess the first answer to me is like an institutional one. It's, you want news media that is less profit-driven and I guess I would contest a little bit with what you said, which was kind of the implication that there was this time at which opinions were empirical or fact-based and people actually cared about this. I think that actually what happened is a much more complicated story. But I think that if you're talking about it from a media perspective, it's really quite simple. Until like the 90s or so, there was very little ideological diversity of the main TV channels. Fox News came on and they specialized into giving stuff to the right. And as a result, MSNBC specialized into the left. And so now you have polarized news media, which reduces trust in news media. Now you don't have experts coming on like Walter Cronkite to tell you the truth. You have experts on Fox News telling you whatever their corporate interests tell you. And I guess on MSNBC, you probably have the same thing, but from a different slant. Though I would probably generally agree with the experts that MSNBC is bringing on for a variety of reasons. So I guess in short, I would say that institutionally, I think that that's the problem there. And I guess the final response I would just say is one of the things that we do know that correlates with less anti-intellectualism is greater education in general, which is rising, and that's good, but also education about how the news functions in particular. There was a neat study from Ukraine which showed that after people were given a course in fake news, they were substantially less susceptible to fake news, which, obviously enough, it sounds simple, but just making people understand how the news works makes them less amenable to believing random crap that you see from a blogger somewhere out of nowhere. Similarly, we have evidence that people who better understand the news process, like the difficulties of reporting, how journalists actually get stories, are much less likely to believe in conspiracy theories. So I think education in particular about media and news production and so on is also just important for providing a more fact-based discussion. So it would be, the answers I would give are like an institutional return to less profitability status, which is more akin to the 70s with more centrist news channels that couldn't really differentiate, and more publicly funded media. And the second would be education in general, and education is specific about news media. So fundamentally, those are the things that seem to lead people to be more quote unquote intellectual or not anti-intellectual about these sort of topics.
Yeah, I think, let me just clarify something first. I definitely don't think there was no perfect objective time, but I think that if you just look at some sort of metric of the percentage of arguments or the percentage of political decisions that are made based on evidence, I think there are certainly times in the past where it was higher, even if it was certainly not perfect. And yeah, I'm a big fan of state-funded media as well. One of the things that I've tried to push for is for the states to adopt some of the media patterns of either European countries or of other Western democracies such as Canada, where you have some sort of standardized guideline, some of which is passed down in universities, some of which is passed down with regards to these alternative funding media, right? And including more online media, more crowd-funded media as well, and to have that kind of save state, essentially, for media integrity. Because I think a lot of the media institutions of today have increasingly kind of given into the same political hobbyist patterns that Hirsh describes. I think I forget who the journalist from the New York Times is. She co-hosts the opinion podcast, The Argument, along with Ross Douthat. Michelle Goldberg, yes, who has described having individual, or not individual, but having personal traumatic effects or personal mental health effects from a lot of the political coverage or the political outcomes that she covers or that she commentates on. And Michelle Goldberg is someone who is on the left. And I think when you have that kind of very personal, intense, almost tangible feeling or effect on journalists' mental health in particular, as well as everyone's mental health in general, you are going to see a raising of the stakes. You are going to see a deterioration in media objectivity. And I think several studies have shown this with both one of, if not the least amount of public trust in media in the United States compared to other Western democracies, as well as with other indices, which I think may be less rigorous, but also show that the United States generally has less transparent media. And yeah, I definitely agree with you that having alternative funding patterns for media, whether it be by the government or whether it be by a charity or some other sort of not profit driven motive, especially for local media, I think would definitely.
That is one of the other big stories, is that local media has just collapsed because it's not profitable. And it doesn't seem like there's a market solution to that. That's probably one of those things that you do actually need some sort of public funded media. And I just wanted to clarify, this is why I interjected, sorry, that there's a difference between public run and public funded. One of the goals of stuff like, it would be, you might want multiple NPRs, like a right leaning and a left leaning NPR, all of which have editorial independence from the government, and their funding is somewhat unconditional. The whole point here is, in fact, to make it so they don't need to run stories that are politically favorable or stories that are like that sell ads, basically. The goal is in part to make them report on media that they think serves the nation's interests or the local community's interest for the local stations. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, how do you think you can combat the fear, somewhat rightful fear actually, that any sort of media reform will be used as a partisan bludgeon, essentially, by those instituting it? How do you think checks can be put into place to both build public confidence in that and also to actually prevent it from being used as a political tool?
I mean, I guess, so in a lot of things, I'm an incrementalist. So one of the simple suggestions would be do it slowly so that people can get used to it. Another suggestion would be do it like in a given state so that you can show that it works there and expand the model. But I guess at a more structural level, how do you make it? I guess my goal would be, you want to make these kind of things sticky and hard to change. So like a lot of the institutions, like say the Federal Reserve, which is reasonably independent, we're not totally, but we're somewhat more independent of, say, Trump than were other federal agencies, which Trump had near complete control over the staffing of. And so I think that ideally you would want, at the minimum, a structure something like that of the Federal Reserve, where, so for example, in the Federal Reserve, it's this whole complicated structure, but in part of those who run the Federal Reserve are appointed by local federal boards. You could imagine something like there could be local NPRs, local WIPRs, and they would appoint people to a federal jurisdiction. So it would be an independent source of power outside of the political system. You could also imagine having if you could somehow do it like a constitutional guarantee, like a constitutional amendment, Congress will spend 0.1% of GDP on public funding of media, and it will do so in a way that it distributes it to like the public funding charity, and it will have no control or little control over that charity. Ideally, you'd want to make things which are hard to change on political whims, and so they're these sort of long-term, mostly politically independent institutions. However, just as a contrast to this, I do believe it's important that people have a democratic input to these things. My other big suggestion would be that I would like a lot of these things to actually just be directly elected by the people. So let's imagine that you have the publicly funded charity, which funds all the WIPRs. Is it WI? I guess it's just NPR. I guess WIPR is like Washington, whatever. All the NPRs of the United States, you'd have that charity, and you just directly have people elect the council that leads that sort of thing. So my basic suggestions would be, at minimum, you want to look at something like the Federal Reserve Board, independent. And more extreme, if I want to get closer to my dreams of like director democracy, it would be something like the people directly elect the heads of these sorts of charities, and you'd want to do it in such a way that it would be very, very hard for any party to get a strong partisan advantage to just push through their agenda. So you could do things like requiring, say, like an 80% majority of the committee to enact change, sort of thing, stuff like that. So this is all complicated and somewhat more like esoteric, but the basic ideas are greater democracy and greater independence.
Yeah, I do want to dive into the weeds there a bit, particularly on the end of elected media figures or elected media board figures.
Mm-hmm.
Because at least, I mean, go into a little bit more detail on how that can be prevented from just falling into partisanship.
So I think that like one of the suggestions for how to make a less partisan Supreme Court, for example, is simply to have Supreme Court votes be ranked choice vote. So let's say that we imagine we have a ranked choice vote. What you tend to get with ranked choice is moderate candidates. Or you could imagine something like proportional representation, which would again get a roughly accurate representation of the general public. Then, too, you could set a higher barrier to votes. So say you wanted the Supreme Court to have to get, 7 out of 9 votes to vote for something. Some cases, the conservatives could maybe get their majority there, and if they had a really strong Supreme Court. But in general, it's only going to be things with near unanimous support. So the dream is basically you'd want some sort of institution where you will generally get moderate-ish, not like extremely partisan people into office. They'll be close to like the center, quote unquote, of American politics. And 2, they will only have the power to do something when almost all of them agree on something. So you maybe get the exclusion of people like Alex Jones, but you still keep a pretty wide ideological berth for stuff like all the way from Fox News and maybe Breitbart over to like stuff on the left. So I guess the 2 answers that I give are a combination of better voting systems and higher voting requirements.
I think the other failure mode to consider here, though, and I think this is definitely a less threatening one, is that if there are bad faith actors that are engaging in kind of misinformation or that are engaging in kind of media misconduct, if they have a minimal amount of representation on these boards, they can essentially kind of cripple the organization by vetoing everything, right?
The goal is, so like one of the things we are seeing in the EU right now is that their structure is veto susceptible. One country like Poland or Hungary decides that they don't want to do a policy, so the entire thing just doesn't work. Because I forget which of their institutions requires unanimity, but basically it requires unanimity. And this was the failure, if you want to look to an American example, of the Articles of Confederation. So specifically, my argument would be, let's say it's like a 20-person board and you need like 75% majority to get something done. It's not veto. It's not one person that can sink it. It has to be a substantial 25% block that wants to oppose something. And at that point, then you can talk about this as being an anti-majoritarian sort of institution. And so I do agree. I think all of these things there are problems with all these institutions. I'm not going to pretend this is perfect. The only question to me is whether it is substantially better and like less susceptible than the current system. And so right now, the analogy is we're looking at publicly funded media whose funding could be cut by Congress if Congress really wanted to cut it, more or less on a whim. You're also talking about privately owned media, which is owned by 6-7 people, and who could ultimately decide to broadcast more or less whatever they want. And to some degree, Fox is more or less just broadcasting whatever the hell it wants, with apparently little to no regard for the facts. And so I think that it's hard to look. Obviously, it's almost always harder to propose an alternative than it is to critique what's present right now. I think my argument in short is that I think that it would be better, somewhat less susceptible to these these failure states, as you call them, than the current system. And I do agree that anything I present is going to be flawed. That's my basic take.
Yeah. Michael Malice, and this isn't an endorsement of his ideology, but he has a formulation that every criticism of his ideology is a description of the status quo. And I think that in some ways this does apply. There are some fundamental problems that are all kind of worked out in different ways that will always kind of leave holes to be patched. And I don't think that this program is certainly not a utopian seeking program at all.
No. And to be clear, I think that you're not going to see this. I don't think of any of the things that I advocate for I'm going to see like nearly any time in the near future. I think that if you want something to look for, it'd be something like a publicly funded pseudo charity run by something like a Federal Reserve Board. That's almost certainly something that you might be able to see, a bit akin to a stronger the Consumer Financial Protection Board, which Warren set up pretty recently. Actually, I think it was back in 2012 or something. That is more akin to what I'm talking about. It would be like a CFPPB with an even stronger, more Federal Reserve-like structure. Those are the kinds of things that we're currently seeing being done in U.S. government.
Isn't the CFPB somewhat susceptible
It is.
to a lot of the to a lot of the political gamesmanship as well. Yeah.
The idea is you need something like CFPB, but it's susceptible. It's not as susceptible as other institutions. Like Trump just appoints people to run like DHS or something, and that's it. So it's less susceptible. It still is though, and it needs to be stronger, more akin. I keep pointing to the Federal Reserve Board just because it has independence. It has greater degree of independence. You want to make it harder and harder for political whims of the executive and Congress to just change people. That's hard. It's like this is a question of how you make functioning democracies, which is an incredibly hard question. So,
yeah, I think one of the major contrasts that I have with the United States and the world, or not the world at large, but other Western democracies, and of course they're not immune from problems as well, but there's this sort of pervasive cynicism in everything from media to politics to even facets of ordinary life that make everything much more difficult. It's almost like I don't know if you know this kind of comparison, but when people who are doing like competitive sports are in like a funk where they're just like off their game, and they're off their game for like the entire tournament or even the next tournament and so on because of one like unlucky thing that happened to them. And I feel like this is very much the state of American politics right now, where there was sort of initial polarization that spiraled out of control, partly due to some of the changes in technology that I think are very responsible. The podcast one of the core central ideas of it is this idea of convergence, where we consider the government or the media ecosystem as kind of a machine that outputs a new version of itself, right? So the media and the political system, right? It creates the media political system of the next year, which creates the media political system of the following year, and so on. Yeah. And I think what we really have to be focusing on is how do you align a lot of these incentives in a way that they're self-correcting. And I think right now, especially with what you have with social media and attention dilution on social media, is you have very strong incentives to further pollute the environment, or not like the physical environment, although there are some incentives to do that as well. But but the information space as well, because with advertisers and with a lot of these media institutions that are essentially coasting off of legacy trust, they have strong incentives to actually make it more difficult for people to try to verify sources, to try to compare the facts, to try to compare the scientific or journalistic rigor that's being done, because they have this inherent advantage already. And it's a very strange game where if they overload the media ecosystem too much, then you have the rise of extremist outlets like OANN. But if they pollute, or if they don't pollute the information environment enough, then they can just be kind of overtaken by more rigorous institutions. And
there's such a strong incentive to just churn out content that seeks to fulfill what people desire, what they want to see. I think that it basically, the institutions that win are the ones that do it, and if you don't participate in it, you will lose. It is there's actually, so I don't want to come off as like a hardcore Marxist or something. There's a neat little quote from Marx in which he asserts, "Don't blame the individual capitalists, don't blame the individual business owners." He was actually pointing to an extreme example of child labor usage in Britain, and he says the reason that all the spinners use children is because if they didn't do it, their competitor would. And so that competitor would outcompete them and they'd go out of business. So everyone is forced to use child labor because someone else is. And the only way you can change it is with a structural shift, which in his case was banning child labor. And in this case would have to be some way to reduce the importance of gaining control of this attention information ecosystem.
Yeah. I think what you have, though, is that you have an environment where it's very difficult to gain trust, where it's almost impossible to gain trust, I think. And because of that. Not just for media institutions, but for government and even for private individuals as well. And because of that, it's incredibly difficult to even change this without the risk of it being gamified, but also the kind of increasing cynicism to make it so that anything will be too weak to be gamified.
Yep.
And I mean, this is like the eternal problem, right? Which is, how do we make sure that good people do good things and bad people can't do bad things? And
if only we could solve this problem.
yes. And I think there is just, of course, the kind of out to this is proper kind of talent assessment and proper kind of truth assessment, essentially, of someone's ability to make predictions and then actually execute them. And this is something that is very much alive to a much higher degree in other Western countries as well, and even in just other countries generally around the world. You don't have this degree of cynicism, and you have a feedback loop where government officials actually do take these incentives and do align their rhetoric with what they can actually promise and actually deliver. I think the question can be like, what is invoke this failure mode? And I think that's what ultimately this podcast is about. Is what birthed this failure mode into existence. And I mean, there are kind of a myriad of factors. Initial public trust, of course, it's a kind of self-destructive cycle, right? But strength of democracy, community organization, I think, might be one of them. But ultimately, I think I settle back on these two ideas. This idea that people are very much overwhelmed in information in even ways that are not the same in other Western countries. You don't have this kind of wall-to-wall reality television news media, right? You kind of I've been living in Canada now for the last few years, so you turn on like Canadian news and you can literally change the channel. Because I live in Toronto, very close to the United States, you can literally change the channel and notice the difference between American and Canadian channels. And the kind of escape mechanism, I think, is one to have a distributed way or a decentralized way of improving this actionably. So to have a program essentially that people can copy paste into their everyday lives that would help ameliorate the system. And that's kind of the exercise of this podcast, is to take these tools, to take this understanding that we have of a lot of these pressures, of a lot of the situation that we're in, and say, what is something that you can do that, if replicated among enough people, will change the cynicism? And I think one of the very interesting things that I've had when doing research for this podcast is that idea of community organizing. Is the idea of, and this is why the calculation is so difficult, because you have this scenario where anything can and almost will be parasitized, right? For every like good faith organizational effort, you will have one that is built on false information or unrigorous information. And I think, yeah, it's just so blurry. Do you have any clarity that you can give on where the trade-offs actually lie? What points benefits change to consequences and vice versa?
I'm sorry. So what was your specific question again? I was thinking about the general question. What was your specific question just now?
Yeah. What is your sense of what a lot of these kind of sliders? What is your sense of if any, of a combination of these policies would be beneficial in actually making a virtuous cycle and making a self-improving cycle. For example, how strong exactly should be local journalism funding? How strong exactly, or how much do we want increase in awareness with regards to community organizing? How much do we want that kind of shift towards social campaigning as opposed to sort of like economic or kitchen table, quote unquote, campaigning, right? And specifically, at what point do like those trade-offs kind of level out?
So I mean, I recently graduated with a BS in economics. So I think that a lot of these things, I conceptually approach these things as, like you said, like there's a trade-off. And so to me, all of these questions can ultimately be empirically solved. Right now, we're just shooting the shit. I think that you could, with a well-crafted study, possibly examine these sorts of issues and find, hey, there's a point at which it starts to be that you've gone too far. We don't have those studies, and we may never have those studies. So to try and begin to answer some of your questions, I think that one of the ideas about community organizing, for example, comes from Hirsh. What are the trade-offs of community organizations? In the past, community organizations, so like in America, we had a long history of ethnic community organizations. Like Jews had like a Jewish, there were in New York City, Jews would have little like Jewish organizations to share funds, Irish would have Irish organizations to share funds, and on and on and on. For every group of immigrants that came in, they'd have their own organization. And so too, we had like union organizations, we had religious organizations, the church and the synagogues and so on would share funds, they would share resources, they would help the candidates elected, and political machines would organize people. And so what Hirsh notes, and this is something we mentioned before, a lot of these organizations were strong enough that they were able to impose like cultural values onto their residents, onto like the members of the community that were, in his opinion, like wrong and from like a modern perspective, deeply, deeply conservative. Like the church was, you know, by no means a great friend of like gay people or women in like the 1900s, for example. So I think that one of the concepts that I quite like is this idea of a closed off system. We were talking a little bit about virtuous cycles. You never want community organization to be so strong that it is able to perpetuate itself, even if it has like serious flaws. And so clearly it was not too strong because it's fallen apart, it's collapsed. And so I don't know where that point is, because it seems to be very far on the side of like more community organization than we had, or stronger community organizations that we had, that point seems very difficult to reach for me. Because fundamentally, I do think that people can tear down institutions that are coercive. An analogy I would point to, for example, is if you just want something to look at as examples of community organization gone too far, so to speak, would be examples of often, and weirdly enough, they often come from America as well, modern cults. So if you look into the organizational structure of the Mormon Church, and to an even greater degree, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they have organizational structures intentionally created so that people who leave the community are excised, they are socially excluded, and they are harmed as a result of that. And not, you know, physically harmed, but financially and relationally harmed. And so it is very hard for people to challenge the structures of the community, and so as a result, they don't. The community, therefore, is very brittle, and it is very resistant to change. And so I want to say that the Jehovah's Witnesses are probably the key example to point to there. It's that you never want community organization to become so strong that it can condition the lives of its members strongly enough that now the community organization can't be overcome. And I can't give you a number like that's you've reached community point 8 and that's too far, but that's the general idea. You want community organizations that were maybe as strong as you saw in like Irish and Jewish and other immigrant communities in the United States, but not nearly so strong as those of like religious cults. And obviously that's just one point. You asked about like 6, but I don't want to go on forever.
Yeah, no worries, don't worry. I was not like expecting an answer to like I was not expecting like a test, like fill out these 6 sections. Yeah. I'm not that cruel.
I guess the only other answer I would give, if you want one more institutional idea as something to look into, in a few states, a few cities in America, they've started doing things called democracy vouchers. these might be in Canada as well, I don't know, where citizens will be mailed, say, like a $20 check, so to speak, which can be given to any individual candidate. And one of the goals there is to shift towards public funding of elections. I think that you could imagine an analogy with that to media funding, where right now the vast majority of funding that media gets comes from advertisement. And so ideally, I think that advertisement in turn is hinged on making people want to come back and watch again and again and again for a long period of time. And so I think that somewhat of a shift to a model that's more akin to like Patreon, more akin to like a subscription service, could produce not necessarily perfect quality content, but slightly higher quality content. So to me, the institutional solutions are one, a shift from advertisement to quote unquote subscriptions, and two, a shift from like private funding in general to a more publicly funded model, because both of these seem to blunt, not eliminate, but blunt some of the profit and attention-seeking motives of media. And obviously, this is only a small part of a much greater whole, but just focusing in on media and community organizations, I think these are my takes on those.
Yeah. With regards to the social ostracization, do you think that's becoming... First of all, I don't think there's too much kind of scientific evidence of this, but with regards to the actions of individual kind of news figures and political figures, do you think that's becoming an increasing problem in political circles of social ostracization based on party? Or
I mean, there was a
issue?
video. There was a video just today of. Do you know who Mitt Romney is? And
yes.
Okay, so he's. For the audience, I guess, for those of you who don't remember, I guess 8 years ago, Mitt Romney, centrist-ish Republican, former Republican candidate for president, so presumably pretty highly respected by the Republican Party. Just today, there were like 2 or 3 videos that came out of him being like harassed and not quite accosted, but like physically intimidated by a variety of like Trump supporters, extreme Trump supporters in an airport. The dude's just traveling. He's just being like an average citizen, basically. And they're shouting traitor on an airport, in an airplane as they travel past him. I think that in general, I do agree that there are very strong incentives to do stuff like cancel culture and this sort of like in-group, out-group stuff. Hirsh has a whole section in his book about the strength of partisan in-group, out-groups, and I do think those are very pernicious. They don't produce good information-seeking traits, right? Just hating on someone because they're a Democrat or just hating on someone because they're a Republican and ignoring everything they say is not a great way to go about things epistemically. And so, too, is ostracizing people from the production of media and the production of knowledge. So, yeah, yes, 100%.
Yeah. And I've very much seen reactions to this from kind of more mainstream institutions now, where there's increasing brewing of kind of mutually assured destruction sentiment, where some of these institutions are now saying, like, if you express these kind of far left or far right beliefs, well, not far right, but like hard right, hard left beliefs, and you are kind of trying to exert pressure on the organization that now you're going to be the one who's out the door. Do you see this as being a possible solution to this, or maybe even just making things worse?
Well, I do know there's a really neat study. I can't remember the name of it, but I think there's actually probably a whole series of studies about the role of center-right and right-wing parties in preventing far-right parties in European parliaments and in European history. So, like, brief history lesson, hyper-simplified, in Germany, one of the reasons why Hitler came to power is because the center party and the center-right chancellor gave Hitler power. And the reason they did so is they wanted to use him tactically in a coalition against the left. In contrast, a whole lot of center-right parties in Europe, both in like more recent and in more historical times, have excluded the far right. And it did seem like in this study that was reasonably successful, that what it seemed like the center-right parties would do, they would shift right on a few key issues like immigration, but they would refuse to let the far-right party and the far-right groups into government, and they would refuse to adopt said positions. They would basically deplatform them, and it did ultimately work. On the general question of deplatforming, I would note that like Alex Jones is, people still talk about him, but mostly because he's a meme and people remember him for his cultural relevance. He no longer has anything like the information reach that he used to have when he was on mainstream syndication. So I do think that that can be a way to chop the ends off of maybe the extreme political like discourse. So I do think that maybe, exclusion is a thing. It's not necessarily a morally right or wrong thing. However, I do think that one of the consequences of exclusion is not just that, we, the neutral arbiters in the center, have decided that once you go too far, you have reached into the intellectual absurd territories, we're going to chop you off. Everyone does this. And so there's a whole lot of evidence that people tend to silo themselves and exclude information from outside of that group. So would I prefer a system where there was less exclusion, where everyone was reading more diverse news sources, even if that meant we'd still have to keep Alex Jones? I would probably say yes. Were it the case that, to give one last stat on this, the only source that a majority of Republicans trust is Fox News. Literally the only source. They don't trust any of the other mainstream sources, more than 50%. I think recently a few talk radio things like Rush Limbaugh ticked up above 50%, but nothing else. And so this results, and there's a bunch of other studies that show similar results. This results in an informational siloing. You don't read diverse materials. You're reading just like center-right or right-wing and far-right news outlets. And so you lose touch with the rest of the political perspective. So I would strongly prefer, in that sense, less exclusion. I do think it has a role. And maybe if it were done well, it could be to positive results. But I think that currently it seems like it is just more closely associated with what I call information siloing. And I don't know if that's exactly what you talked about in the information cliff, but I would consider this part of how people cut themselves off from other kinds of information.
Yeah, and there's also another study done. I'm just trying to find it now, where they showed that people who had strong priors and strong networks of one party, even when exposed to opposing beliefs, actually these opposing beliefs actually cause them to harden their partisan viewpoints instead of actually appealing to them.
So I do believe on that one, I'm pretty sure you're thinking about the backfire effect study. And it's a really interesting study, but it hasn't been replicated. There was a replication study that attempted to show that you could see the backfire effect for a variety of issues. And in general, for all the other issues, it failed. And so it does seem like people are reasonably amenable to being told facts. However, I will note that it is possible that certain ways of telling people facts might cause them to harden. So it's certainly possible that's true, but maybe not in the general case. And I can send that review. I thought it was an interesting article about the backfire effect.
Yeah, I'm just trying to also find that study right now. Aside from that, though, I think there might be, okay. Alex generally changed their mind. Okay. I think one of the other kind of macro media effects that has happened, and I've actually covered this on an episode of Metapolitics as well, is that you have an interaction between these partisan media environments that prevent the rise of more centrist kind of quote unquote exhausted middle media, where you'll have this culturification of basic fact reporting. So regardless of the actual standard of rigor that's being applied, as long as you have a journalistic institute with any sort of opinion, any sort of even like coverage, either positive or negative, of various social issues that are extremely polarizing, things like abortion, transgender issues, race, all of the kind of culture war stuff, that the existing partisan outlets, either on the right or the left, attack these kind of more centrist or more objective sources based on those individual cultural pieces, even if the rest of their reporting is relatively credible. So you have an effect where right-wingers will, for example, attack Axios, and you also have left-wingers attack the same institution because they had, even on like completely unrelated articles, they'll have like one kind of more conservative leaning article on something like transgender rights, I think it was, and then you'll have a completely different article criticizing Joe Biden or criticizing some Democratic candidate. And a lot of it is just basic fact reporting, that we will see attacks coming from MSNBC or from other individual left-wing journalists that cite like this completely unrelated article based on these culture war topics to try to discredit them, even though, of course, these are kind of not really scientific issues to be reported on or journalistic issues to be reported on, as opposed to the article that they're actually baselessly attacking. And you see the same behavior on the right as well.
Yeah, and I think that to me, this is fundamentally the key problem with social exclusion and its impacts on epistemic openness. I like one of their key reasons why you don't want closed groups is because the only reason you think that your group should last forever is if you think that what the group believes is right. And I think that everyone should have what's called epistemic humility. You should recognize that even if you think your beliefs are very secure, take a look at what you believed 3 years, if not 3 months ago, realize how much you've changed, and have humility in your beliefs. And if you haven't changed your beliefs, I guess, either props to you or possibly consider reading a different source of information. There's a reason why people are so uncertain about the beliefs they hold. And it is important, therefore, to build like flexible institutions and flexible ways to interact with knowledge, which this sort of exclusionary group-based approach to information is so problematic. Have you ever had a chance to read about? There's a book called Right-Wing Authoritarianism, I believe. Have you ever had a chance to read about that sort of? It's called a psychological profile before.
I don't think I've read a book with that title in particular. I've read like some things on that topic, but not anything with that specific title.
So it's called The Authoritarians by Bob Altemeyer, and it's not a perfect book, and some of its stuff again hasn't been fully replicated. One of his claims, for example, is that there are no authoritarians on the left. This seems to be mostly due to basically failures of his studies, but there's this basic idea that there is evidence that there are certain types of ways that people think, particularly that are associated with an authority subservient mindset, which leads people to trust. It leads people to trust in-group sources, like your church pastor, like Fox News, and to just distrust out-group sources. And so this is not something exclusive to the right. It's not just exclusive to something with people with the authoritarian mindset. Everyone does this, but certain types of people are more susceptible to this. And one of the things that I would note is that more education, less religiosity, generally seems to make people more open to reading and believing out-group sort of perspectives. This is one of the reasons why I try to advocate for people to and knowledge about like the news sources. One of the whole points is that people should be open to reading things that disagree with them, and it's really hard to do so when people have this sort of exclusionary approach to knowledge. So I do totally, or at least very strongly, agree with you there.
Yeah, and one point that might actually be very interesting with regards to these kind of exclusionary effects is that they hypothetically would be self-ending, right? Hypothetically. And yeah. I mean, there always is that kind of like accelerationist argument. I mean, that kind of has a bad rap with regards to like anarchism, with regards to all sorts of more violent ideologies, but I think you can have like a democratic accelerationism where you're hoping for some of these pressures to play themselves out for more of these extreme factions to essentially go on ostracizing people until there's no one left for them to ostracize, and everyone is actually just on the outside, and you can form your own community there.
I mean, one thing people on the left have been really happy about recently is Nick Fuentes, who is a basically Nazi. He denies the Holocaust. He's like a super hard right race realist. He was advocating for people not to vote for Republicans in Georgia. He was happy when the Republicans lost in Georgia. That sort of thing from the left seems like a good thing. Not only, one, because it means that we got an immediate political goal, but two, it means that there is a breaking of the hard right from the Republican Party. To me, this is a good thing. I want those people to exclude themselves from the Republican Party if they can do what basically, the whole point of the study about center-right parties excluding the far right is that now the far right doesn't get to be in the government. Their views aren't legitimized. If the far right wants to do that to themselves, be my guest. I would totally support that.
Yeah. I think the Republican Party also tends to be a lot more self-policing with these types of things as well, with regards to, at the very least, explicitly kind of like excluding, I think, Stephen King, for example, from the party. Former representative from Iowa, and a lot of these kind of reactions to policies, which they very much see as kind of off the rails. Whereas with regards to, and I think this is unfortunately anecdotal, like you just don't have enough national political figures to actually kind of analyze this scientifically. But I think there's just been a longer pattern of this kind of exclusion, or this kind of essentially being sick of things on the right, than of like cultural extremism or of conspiracy theories on the left, I think. Do you see that being reflected, or do you have a different point of view?
I mean, I would think, I don't know. I think that could be a whole topic onto itself.
That's true.
I think that something that a lot of people on the further parts of the left, which I would include myself, have noted is that there is a whole lot of infighting. A joke that I sometimes tell, and the original joke was about Judaism. It's, ask 7 Jews to define Judaism, and you'll get 11 answers. It's the same thing for socialists. Ask 7 socialists for a definition of socialism, you'll get 11 answers. There's a lot of infighting and exclusion on the left, and I think that has harmed it as a political movement. And if you don't like the left, that's probably a good thing. And if you don't like the far right, then infighting on the far right is also a good thing. I would just say that I think that a recent trend in the Republican Party has been a greater normalization of conspiratorial thinking and of undemocratic actions. Like Ted Cruz, former Republican presidential candidate, I want to say got 20-30% of the vote, not an insubstantial figure, is now going to vote, I believe, against certifying the ballots in DC. QAnoners are going to Congress. It's hard, I think, I think the modern Republican Party has increasingly been willing to adopt more extreme elements, but it is good to see them still forced, I think, to exclude some elements like Steve King, and hopefully trying to exclude elements like people like Nick Fuentes, who are hard right or race right.
Yeah, and I think there's been kind of agreement not to give the QAnon advocate any sort of committee position as well. I think just with regards to the left, there's been a sort of popularity of very much conspiratorial or anti-scientific stances on things like race, where you see a significant failure to account for various mitigating factors like immigration, for example. One of the, I think, most damaging lines of rhetoric that's been actually widely adopted now, which is very worrying, is like, quote unquote, boardrooms should look like America, or that like the tech industry should look like America. Mm-hmm. And it's just very ignorant of immigration and of the fact that, of course, there is just a disproportionately high number of people who are Asian around the world. African countries tend not to have very effective public education systems, and obviously that's something you can try to fix as well, right? Mm-hmm. But you have this maligning of, that's a bit too politically charged, I think, but you have this significant misreporting or almost fear-mongering, I think, based on racial lines in many factions of the American of the I don't want to say Democratic Party. Like I hate when people say like the Democrats or the left in general, because obviously they're a group of individuals with different opinions. But I think you have a consistent support of Democratic politicians of some of these unscientific talking points that are actively damaging to the political discourse and are somewhat close to conspiratorial, in my opinion.
I mean, I guess we could talk about that if you would like. I guess one of the questions a little bit, I didn't fully, sorry, how do I put this? I would be happy to keep talking. I didn't know about how long you wanted this podcast to go, so I just didn't know if you had a preferred stopping point or a topic you want to wrap up on.
Not particularly. I mean, there's still a lot to talk about with regards to the information exchange and with regards to, I think, a very valuable perspective of how to analyze these things from the left. But also, I want to get to artificial and generalized intelligence and the People's Republic of Walmart.
Sure. Would you like to? Sorry, would you maybe like to talk a little bit about those topics, and then maybe that could be a good ending point maybe for the podcast.
Yeah, that would be great. But I think, yeah, I just want to get your take on kind of the cultural kind of, or the racial kind of, the problem is, right, okay, the problem with describing these types of things is that it's hard to describe a very kind of like disorganized group in the same way that you would say it's hard to describe like right-wing elements or far-right elements even, right? Mm-hmm. Where you have people who are just making illusions, and I think this might be the case for some of these elements as well, but you also have elements, or I want to say like individuals even, who are making almost explicitly, who are advocating for explicitly discriminatory policy in U.S. government. That is extremely damaging. And there's been much less of a pushback on this from Democratic Party officials as opposed to otherwise. Where do you have any like kind of understanding of this and why it's actually happening mostly on cultural grounds instead of on economic grounds, which they seem to be all too willing to kind of attack?
I mean, I think that, like in general, I would note like the scientific consensus is that race isn't real. So I will say like that's absolutely true. I think that on like affirmative action policies, which I think is kind of at the crux of the question, I do generally think I would personally prefer a more of an economics-based affirmative action, if for political reasons, if nothing else, because it would take the race issue a little bit out of it, and so it would make it less of a social issue and more of an economic issue. And I think that we do know that economically, people do like the idea of helping the poor get into college and so on. So it's a politically winning issue, where affirmative action is, due to its fragmentation of people on racial lines, somewhat of a losing issue. I would say that I think that there can be a role. Have you ever, just to frame it, have you ever heard the terms positive or negative discrimination?
Yes.
So the idea is, let's say that a group is currently facing negative discrimination. You want to solve this, but you think that there's a cyclic effect where, because a group was discriminated against in the past, they can't get ahead now. How do you solve this? Fundamentally, you need some way to break the cycle by like boosting up that group. This is, I guess, kind of the concept of the idea of equity. So in positive discrimination, you might need to positively favor some groups, which due to historical reasons have been unable to get ahead, to give them that advantage, to break that cycle, and then to eliminate the need for positive discrimination in the future. Like eventually, the theory would go, eventually you would no longer need this positive discrimination. It's like a temporary discrimination to reduce discrimination in the long run. Or to put it in a very utilitarian terms, you're basically increasing discrimination in the short run to remove discrimination in the long run. So it's a sort of utilitarian calculus, I think, that can be justified in certain contexts. Whether it currently is justified, I think that's a more complicated question. And like I said, I think for political reasons, regardless, I would support more economic-based affirmative action. That would be my take there.
Yeah, I think here's where it really ventures into the difficult, and I think it ventures into the difficult with regards to dealing with the right wing as well. For example, with dealing with a lot of the Trump stuff, right? But there really has to be an effort to, I say, like separate the Epsteins from the QAnons. And when you have because Epstein is fairly well documented, at least some of the more kind of consensus claims about it with regards to court filings, legal documents, etc., of the fact that he did have several high wealth, high status patrons who engaged along with him with the sexual exploitation of minors, right?
Mhm.
Now, it is a factually true statement to say that Epstein had a cabal of pedophiles.
Technically,
It is also not a statement that you should say, because the actual kind of emotional or the narrative implications of that is that there is a much more deep-rooted affection for Epstein or connection with him in these kind of interior political circles, business circles, that extends much beyond what the evidence shows.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the kind of stage I want to set for this.
Sure.
And I think particularly from a foreign perspective, it seems incredibly damaging when you have allegations, baseless allegations, that a large number of Americans are racist, or that particularly that a large number of Americans hold racist beliefs. And I don't think that this is something that, for example, Joe Biden holds. I think this is something that is often also used to falsely attack candidates that do not actually believe in those ideas, but that there is also a contingent, particularly in journalistic outlets, that believe in this and that have stated this explicitly, that are incredibly problematic to the information space and to avoiding conspiratorial belief in things like polarization. Oh, where do you see kind of like a left-wing way to address this with the necessary nuance without giving into the kind of like baseline like anti-SJW kind of stereotypes, and actually dealing with this in a way that, like I said, separates the Epsteins from the QAnons, that actually addresses the conspiratorial elements without saying like all left-wing policy bad, all kind of like social justice is bad, because that's not, I think, what the vast majority of Americans think, the vast majority of people think, and what I think, right?
I mean, I think that I will agree that, like, rhetorically, it's very damaging to say that most Americans are racist. I think that when people say that, they often what they're using is a different definition of racism than people think. So racism usually implies what's sometimes called explicit racism. It would be like someone who knows they're racist and acts in racist ways. So this has, by a variety of measures, seems to have gone down enormously. Like the portion of people who support interracial marriage today is like 96% or something, 95%. Back in the 60s, it was like 4%. So on explicit measures of explicit racism, America is much less racist. There are obviously, it's not gone, and there are plenty of people who still are explicitly racist. You might even consider Trump possibly to be among them for invoking certain fears of the other. I think that usually what people are trying to refer to is this idea of implicit or unconscious, or like basically this idea of racism which isn't intentional. And so there's two meanings of that. The first is that maybe you have some racial biases which you aren't fully aware of. And so there's lots of studies that people can do which show that people have a negative bias against, for example, people of darker skin tones, which is called colorism. And so people generally bias themselves against candidates who are perceived as darker skin. There are literally studies that you can do. There's a famous one, for example, in medicine, which showed that when doctors were told a patient is like black versus when he's not black, they prescribed the black fewer painkillers, even though otherwise the description of the patients was identical to the white patient. And to be clear, that discrimination is sort of based, we think, in an underlying belief that like blacks are big, strong, strapping men who don't need painkillers, and whites are these fragile little men who need like painkillers, sort of thing. which in this case is like a stereotype against African Americans. People see them as like brutes or like violent. And so I do think that there's a lot of evidence that is prevalent. And so I think when people say Americans are racist, it's perceived as the first one. It's perceived as you're saying that everyone wants segregation. But what people really mean is this more nuanced take that you have biases that you may not even be aware of, and even biases that you may not want to hold, but that you hold regardless towards people of certain backgrounds. And the solution to that ultimately can only be something through like contact theory, where you simply interact with people of different backgrounds and you come to have less biases against them. So the solution there is ultimately integration. And I guess I'll leave it there. So I think that the way to approach this is, from a rhetorical perspective, is explicitly say what you mean. I would say is, when you say that like many Americans are racist, explicitly say that you mean this, not that they are intentionally racist, not that they necessarily have politically racist beliefs, not necessarily that they want to discriminate, but that they might have biases that are actually very hard to eliminate. And I will note that a lot of the, like we have whole studies showing that biases like these, due to like past experience, are often very, very hard to remove. It's not just something that people chose to have, it's more or less something they got because of how they were raised. And so the only way in the long term you can eliminate stuff like this is by building a more inclusive, more like mixed society, where people don't have these exclusionary views of the other.
Yeah, I think, once again, this is just something that is very much something that should be acted upon on the individual level, because I do think there are people who do believe that, and that there is evidence for this as well, of course, in things like carding that should definitely be reformed. Police carding, where essentially police exercise the power to arbitrarily stop people, and this happens to be enforced discriminatorily. And you have this, and at the same time, though, you have the existence of pressures of political activist groups, etc., pushing for an increased salience in race, not pushing for, and of course some of this could be due to electoral incentives as well, but actually addressing, I think, the fundamental kind of mindset of this is that you have people pushing for an increasing salience, also almost an obsession over race, instead of over things like economic conditions, instead of over things like overall performance when it comes to hiring, right? And you see this particularly, I think, in Silicon Valley, which is I know many people involved in, and somewhat tangentially involved in, full disclosure, but you have a situation where some of these, the existence of these biases in certain areas, some of which are very real, are then used to justify self-conflagrating policies that both damage damage the impression or the reputation of racialized people, and at the same time also don't achieve the goals that they purport to. Of course, hiring in Silicon Valley, I think, is one of the most damaged processes here, because the important thing to understand about Silicon Valley is that it's an incredibly tight labor market. That's why people make so much money doing software engineering. And if there are people who have the sort of baseline competencies, for example, there's not a lot of kind of accreditation screening that goes on, particularly in some of the not like the incredibly big name like FANG stocks, right? But in some of the other groups in Silicon Valley, where there is very little kind of screening, even by semi-beneficial factors like university education, right? Factors that actually have correlations. And so the process of recruiting is very much kind of like this basic competence test. And nonetheless, there are allegations of discrimination, which I think, or not just I think, but are kind of evidentiarily rejected based on the actual performance metrics and so on, with regards to recruiting in Silicon Valley, and with regards to things like training. Once again, that there is evidence that there is no evidence of, and that, I mean, ultimately it is just a question of interpretation, right? But there is also the rhetoric that is used by many of these activists and many people who are even employed by journalistic institutions of actually explicitly stating things like everyone hates African Americans or things like that, right? Every American like holds those beliefs. And once again, I don't think that's the majority of the Democratic voters, and I don't think that's most Democratic politicians even. But there are elements who are acting in those manners, and this is just such a difficult issue to address, because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You don't want to hurt people who are legitimately concerned, but at the same time, you have these policies and you have these very powerful individuals who are actively pushing ideas that are harmful, that are divisive and not beneficial, and also implementing policies that are actively causing damage to both the structure as a whole and to people of that minority group that they're supposedly representing.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I know virtually nothing about like the empirics behind Silicon Valley testing. I can't speak to that whatsoever. I just don't. So what I would say about the rhetorical level behind it is, I think that a lot of people on the left and in general have not had the. So let me put it like this: most people know that race isn't biologically real. They agree with the biological consensus. So they see a disparity of like blacks doing worse than whites. And what's the simplest explanation? What's the simplest rhetorical way to kind of come at that is to talk about it in terms of discrimination, to say that there's like actively discrimination in this particular process. But it might be that this process doesn't actually involve any discrimination whatsoever. This process is in fact perfectly race neutral, which is what you're suggesting. That might be the case. So it is much simpler, and I think this is part of why it's done. It is much simpler, just both in a narrative aspect and like a mental process aspect, to just say, hey, this test must be biased, than it is to have a whole article detailing all of the ways in which, say, the American educational system fails people of color, fails people who are poor, and therefore that this might lead to a systemic reason why blacks and people of color in general, why racialized people in general, would do worse on these tests, regardless of whether the test is in fact discriminatory. And so I think that it's basically due to ease and due to practice, because what I didn't mention before is I think that most people on the left and Americans in general haven't had that conversation about race, and often haven't had the background in like discussing all of the many ways in detail, like empirically, that like people of color and racialized people and so on are harmed by the system. And so I think that my basic summary for why people do this is I think that it's easy and it's the conversation they've had before. And it's also, I think that the reason why they've had it before is in part because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of areas where discrimination is present, like policing. And so they think, well, discrimination explains it here. What's a simple way to explain why that there's a problem here? Well, it must be due to more discrimination. And so I think that there's a variety of like human cognitive biases, which might lead to assuming that you're 100% correct. It's like a totally race neutral test that might lead to people seeing that and just assuming the simplest possible thing. And I do think that that is damaging because it does shift focus away from the real cause, the real solution, which should ultimately be at the source, at the cause of educational and like performance disparities between individuals of different races. It focuses on This is like one of the problems with the focus, the hyper focus on affirmative action and on the unfocus on like education funding, interestingly. So I think a lot of people talk about affirmative action, but they spend very little time talking about one of the best things Joe Biden is going to do, hopefully, if he gets his education policy passed, is actually a really, really big increase of federal funding to poor schools. I think he's going to more or less double or triple federal funding to poor schools, and he's going to double or triple funding to psychological healthcare professionals in said schools. I think you can read that on his education policy for K-12 somewhere on his website, unless I guess he's scrubbed it of all these progressive parts now that he's in power. So I thought that was really, really good. That gets at the key source of it. And I do think that having conversations which are dominated more by these professional level things, which are, people age 24, 25, does tend to shift blame away from the root causes, which are much more structural and systemic at people at younger ages due to stuff like funding, location, integration, and so on. So I do think it's bad. I do think it's a bad part of the conversation. However, I'm trying to offer a little bit of sympathy. I don't necessarily think a lot of people are doing this maliciously. I think that they're doing this basically just because of limitations of what they've read before, because most people haven't had the conversations of like, here's how you argue against race realism. Here's why race realism is stupid. Here's how you solve differences in race. Instead, they've had conversations about discrimination. They've had conversations about biases. And so they see something, they think about it as bias. They don't think about it in the other one. So I would just say I am sympathetic a little bit to this simplification, even if I think it ultimately causes bad effects, and I try to encourage people not to do it.
Yeah, one of the formulations that I like using just in...
Also, wait, brief introduction. Can I get some water?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I can still hear you. I got wireless.
Yeah.
We are back.
Hi.
Sorry.
No worries. It's very understandable.
All right.
Yeah, one of the formulations that I'm a fan of is that affirmative action is a cover-up, which is that if you have for example, if you have a chemical spill in a town, and half the town, let's just remove the race from the picture, but like the south side of the town is damaged by this chemical leak, and they're suddenly not doing well at like sports.
Mm-hmm.
And you have and now you suddenly have your citywide sports team that is dominated by people from the north. And then I think the pathology when it comes to kind of affirmative action like systems is we don't want people investigating into this. Let's just shove a bunch of people from the south onto the team and hope no one notices, right? And I think that's very much the kind of approach to this where, yeah, I think I would agree with that kind of...
I will just say, sorry. Oh, so I will just say, in one partial difference, slightly different defense of affirmative action. So the analogy with chemical waste, I think, is apt. But one thing that it does miss is a little bit of, I mentioned about cyclical issues. So one of the goals of affirmative action is to break cyclical sort of issues. Chemical waste is like a one-time shock, but it'll be as if there was a side of town that got a chemical waste like every year dumped on it or something. And the only way for someone to stop the chemical waste would be if people on the south side did well enough in sports that they got the attention economy to actually pay attention to the chemical waste being dumped there. So complete the analogy. The argument that affirmative action gives is you need Black people in positions of power. You need Black people in positions like those corporate boards. And the only way that you can get them to do so is if they get through college, even if they might not be fully on par with everyone else, to break that cycle of like professional, to enable certain people, particularly Black, but it's also other racialized groups in the United States. To enable people to get onto these positions of power, you need to break said cycle. And so I just do think that the case for affirmative action is a little bit stronger than it is just the case of the cover-up. But I do think I will agree with you that it does, and in particular from conservative sides, it often really, really works to shift the conversation from talking about like educational disparities throughout the board, throughout the lifetime of individuals, to just focusing on the higher level professional aspect of it. It would be as if instead of talking about funding for youth league soccer, you only talked about, as you were talking about, like the high level game or something. So I do think that rhetorically it has a bad effect there. It shifts focus. It is a little bit of a cover-up.
Yeah, and I think like just to complete the kind of explanation for it, I agree in many areas of that. And like the idea is that like you want to fix the chemical spill if there's like an ongoing leak, and you want to have like actual resources directed at that problem. And I think that problem in the United States is very much public education and a lagging of American public education behind their Western counterparts. And I think that's something that very much needs to be reformed, and that will actually address many of these kind of educational differences, right? Yeah. So,
Sure.
do you want to talk about People's Republic of Walmart and AGI socialism?
Sure. I mean, so I used to be like a big planning socialist. I used to be everything should be big baddie, government should run everything. But I've moved away from that a little bit. I'm more of a market socialist now, which means that I want, like, say, the state to nationalize and run some things, maybe say healthcare. But I also want the market to run some things in areas where it seems like competition is more important than centralization. So the analogy would be that it might be more efficient to have one firm basically run healthcare, which is the government. And in other areas, it's really good to have 100 firms competing on how best to sell you shoes. So where that line is and how much government involvement, those are, I think, empirical questions. To actually get to the People's Republic of Walmart and what it says, the basic idea of the People's Republic of Walmart is a solution to what's called the economic calculation problem. It says, hey, you look inside Amazon, you look inside Walmart, and there aren't markets there, or at least not important ones. The vast majority of what Amazon does every single day is on a variety of distributed computers telling product A to go over here on shipping B on like C, and all of these things are ultimately not done by humans even. They're mostly computerized at this point. This suggests that these firms are de facto internally centrally planned. They are like a miniature centrally planned economy. That's the argument of the People's Republic of Walmart. And it's something that people have noted, and the book People's Republic of Walmart notes this, and other authors about planning have noted this. This is something that was noted as early as the author Robert Coase, who is famous for what's called the Coase theorem, which is basically a defense of private property rights in solving externalities. So the TLDR idea of People's Republic of Walmart is, if firms can do it, why can't the state? And the answer that a market socialist like I would give you is there are additional benefits not captured in the idea of central planning in terms of efficiency. So there may be an additional efficiency of having Amazon and Walmart because they have to compete with each other and because you can choose between one and the other. So the analogy would be drawn is that if you want, I think that the strongest case that I would be comfortable with is something called like the Lange-Lerner model, which is Lange-Lerner, the Lange-Lerner model of socialism, which basically has a market of consumer goods, which you use to set the prices for various consumer goods, and in turn you use those prices to pay firms and to choose which firms to like pay and choose which firms not to pay, how much they should produce, and so on, and plan everything all the way back to the raw resource production. That's very simplified, but that's the idea. On the other hand, I think the argument for more classical market socialism, which is like, the state is 50% of the economy or something, and the market's the other 50%. Is that competition provides benefits from innovation and it provides benefits from experimentation. So sometimes there's benefits to different firms producing new products, like startups. We know empirically are associated with higher rates of innovation. Small firms produce more innovation per capita than big firms do. It seems to be just in the nature of the size of firms. So that's probably good. You probably want to have that for some areas. And then conversely, also just having different firms experiment with different like structures, different types of products, that can also be useful because it can, people might not just desire shoes, they might desire different types of shoes. And so one argument for multiple types of firms is they might produce different types of products, where the government, if it had its hands, might only produce one type of healthcare. Though, of course, I think that that's a little bit simplified. And I do think that you can have like, the government doesn't need to provide the one healthcare plan. It can, in fact, provide two types of healthcare plans, for example. But that's the TLDR.
Yeah, and I think one of the visualizations that, oh my God, I'm just completely blanking here, but the author made was that if you look at the kind of hierarchical interactions versus the kind of market interactions, it would look like big blobs of, it would look like kind of big blocks of essentially companies that are planned and relying, or not relying on, but like with small linkages between them of trade, right?
Yeah,
where you would think of, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the full analogy there is, they said, what if an alien came to Earth and they looked at what the structure of our economy would look like? Would they notice the market, or would they notice the massive centrally planned internally firms? And so the argument is that they would notice those huge red hierarchical blobs, and the little green lines linking between them, that might be an afterthought, is their argument.
Yeah, and I think what is really interesting, I think, is how the idea of an artificial generalized intelligence plays into this, of kind of superhuman, infinitely adaptable, or not infinitely, sorry, but adaptable artificial intelligence that can essentially solve this calculation problem given enough data. And I think this actually is a question that is incredibly intriguing just with regards to the nature of an AGI itself. And of course, we're dealing entirely in hypotheticals now. But essentially what it would be is that it would, at least with the current kind of trajectory of artificial intelligence, we would imagine that an AGI would be incredibly good at translating skills. So managing, say, one resource and then managing a different resource in a similar way, for example. But it's one of the most kind of difficult, if not the most difficult tasks, is to have something that generates novelty, that generates something that like can't be imagined, not just by like the data that was fed to the artificial intelligence, but by like the creator itself. And I think that's the central tension between this type of state. And just my kind of like armchair theorizing from what I know about this, which is, I mean, some amount. I don't know too much actually about the economics of it, but what you might have is you might have a resource distribution that's based somewhat on like the central tenets here. And actually, I want to prefix this just for my audience, because I think they might not be as into socialism as the Socialism Done Left crowd.
Probably not.
But saying that AGI socialism might work is like saying that like socialism might work if you were able to like ask God, right? Or ask like a lesser available like not necessarily omnipotent, but like an extremely powerful like superhuman figure. To
you don't get
things.
God,
so,
you
like,
just get like a little deity, right? Like sub God.
Yeah, like
God's intern.
If we have AGI is an incredibly big if here, right? There's already like a whole new world of completely different changes after that. But yeah, there are just so many interesting mechanisms to explore with this, right? And I'm just going to formulate this in terms of layers. So the first layer is kind of like this distribution mechanism that I think if you have a very good AGI will work. I think the tenets of the book fit like incredibly well with the idea of like the general sense of what it does. The second layer
here
is
meaning like giving goods to consumers, right? Or giving goods between firms. Yeah.
Actually, small interjection. How are like rewards based? Because it talks about like setting up like essentially public markets that goods get distributed to, but I'm not sure how like productivity is rewarded, like how.
So like
how
I said,
creation is rewarded.
Sure. So like I said, if you ask, I've said it before, if you ask 7 socialists to define socialism, you'll get 11 definitions. I, as a market socialist, and as someone who's read a little bit about like pay scales, do think that varying pay and varying rewards based on pay does seem to produce better results. If you want a really neat study about that, the one that I often point to is about merit pay or performance pay in education. There's a meta study on it. It showed that when performance pay is present in an educational system, it's equivalent to about adding 4 weeks of education to that system, or about 1 month. So it would be as if you could add $0 additional dollars to an educational system, but get a whole extra month out of it. That's quite worthwhile. I can send you that study afterwards. I can find it pretty easily. And so to note, though, just as an argument to be clear, that this is nothing like the pay gaps we're currently talking about. Performance pay in education is like a 2 times gap. Right now, the median gap between worker and CEO is 250 times. It is not clear that you need inequality of anything like what we currently observe to make people work hard. My answer, I would totally still keep performance pay. I would still keep a pay difference between doctors and, like, I guess janitors or something, but it might be like a 10 times difference. Right now, it's enormously larger. That's the sort of argument.
Yeah, I think with AGI, what you would have is you would have a decimation of large sections of the economy, which we consider as like rote intellectual labor, or even things that, like, the classic idea is like an accountant, right, or someone who like fills out a spreadsheet. But it might even go beyond that into taking over things like sports journalism, for example. Taking over things like music, especially popular music, taking over things like film production. And I think what eventually happens is that you have an incredibly high premium on things that are like new variables that are completely novel to the artificial intelligence, that essentially like expand their conception space by like a new dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there may not be like the existing wealth gaps of like, here's a person who makes $10,000, here's a person who has $10,000 to their name, here's a person who has like 1 billion, right, or like 100 billion. But I think, are you familiar with the idea of fuck you money?
I am no. Oh, is it just having enough money to like that you can do anything feasibly, or I don't know. Sorry, what? How would you call it?
I think this was either like featured on Joe Rogan or was like coined by him. But he's like, there's a certain number of people who have fuck you money and don't have enough money to like not have to care about like the predations of like the outside world. And this isn't actually that related. It just sounds funny, but yeah. But I think you end up with a situation where scientists, or like, I say scientists in like a very much narrower term here, because a lot of science or like a lot of data collection could actually be automated in this hypothetical world where we have AGI. But the people who like generate these new variables, I think there will be a mechanism for rewarding them with fuck you money. With like money that, like, if you make a contribution, just like make like a contribution to expand the power of the AGI, is just like completely is just like an extraordinarily valuable kind of reward system.
Well, I think that sorry, just a brief interjection. There's a really interesting argument here that we know that markets enormously underinvest in R&D and research and development. And so one of the key functions of the state has been, like since the 30s in particular, has been funding R&D, funding research. We also know that in some states, like a lot of the Nordic countries, they even just directly fund startups, and they directly fund this creation of new knowledge, new variables. I don't think it's that hard to imagine that increasingly as we move into the future, as technology gets harder and harder to adopt, as the barriers to new innovation get harder and harder, there's lots of neat studies showing that the average age of people who make patents keeps going up and up and up. And I think the easy answer for why is science gets harder and harder and harder, and humans are not getting nearly so smart with it. We are falling behind, as it were, like the knowledge sort of required. And so I think that as that happens, it requires a greater and greater investment in technology. So I think that this is true, even if we don't get God to come down and give us one of his interns to run all of our economy, it is absolutely the case that you should want an economy where there is more active investment in new ideas and new firms and so on than the current market provides. So agree.
I think this is actually, it's also something that completely changes what our idea of science is, because you have, like, right now even you have things like GPT-3, which are essentially very strong like translation models, which basically means that they can like look at a pattern and then look at something similar and then figure out that the first thing or that the second thing is similar to the first thing, and then like transfer over their knowledge. A good formulation of this is, for example, like writing a sentence and composing like a simple melody. right? You essentially have these building blocks that stick together in various ways that look nice. And these translation models are very effective in actually applying those principles at kind of a rudimentary level. So a lot of the science, which is essentially like, ironically, something that's being done with AI itself right now, is literally just taking this thing that's already been developed for, say, like playing games, or for say like managing a resource, and just copying it over. Another thing is like diagnostics, right? You have like generalized like diagnostic software for identifying patterns, and then just like identifying like a pattern in like a series of dots or like some encoding, and having essentially entire industries or entire like industrial revolutions built up of just like copy pasting that into various contexts, like into cancer diagnosis, into just all sorts of kind of medical subfields. And I think, I don't remember where this is from, but there's a very interesting quote that's like, every other industrial revolution is just the copy pasting of the first one, of the previous one. And I think that's, oh man, this is such a tangent, but yeah, I think this is very interesting. The other things is...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I'm just like going on like such a long tangent here, right? But okay, so the other thing I think that we always have to be worried about with regards to any sort of kind of administrative state is like a failure mode, right? Is there like a failure mode? And this is also something that you have to be incredibly worried about with AGI, because one of the kind of central themes of it is that there are these convergent goals. These goals that like come up no matter what task you're trying to achieve, and one of these convergent goals is to gain more power. And you have to be like very threatening, or like you have to be like very worried about threats from the AGI of just like, for example, if you have people who would say, if you have like a democratic mechanism for changing the way the algorithm works, then the algorithm actually has the incentive of like starving to death people who would want to change it.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, like you could have an algorithm that like develops to that point. And so there are all sorts of like incredibly interesting questions about how to have like a democratic system in this world, if that would function based on like the social pressures, based on like how things would be very fundamentally different, and how to actually like adjust many of these incentives for like new variable change, or what you would consider like generative learning, right?
Yeah, and so I can't speak to this. I have little to no. I know about AI, and I've like seen it apply, and I read some of the papers. I know virtually nothing about the whole like more ethical questions, like how do you apply theoretically a learning enabled artificial intelligence to questions of like social power. I have absolutely no background, so I can't speak to that. The only things that I would note is that I would tend to think a lot of the things that we've learned from what makes good democratic institutions would probably apply to models of AI. So if we imagine, for example, that we can create one AGI, it might be possible to create multiple AGI and force them to compete in such a way that the one which like kills the least people is the one which like we are giving power to. And so I don't know if that's, I'm sure that's been something that's proposed. I have no idea of the implications of that, but that's fundamentally the idea of having like political parties. It's you vote for the guy who thinks is going to cause you less economic harm or more economic gain. And so even just letting people choose between algorithms, which in turn are in fact competing with each other, might be a feasible solution. Or how do I put this? If algorithms are power seeking, it might be possible to lean into that rather than leaning away from that by making it explicitly part of the way that we choose between algorithms. To make part of that learning function, their goal should be to benefit people and not just to kill them, or at least to benefit them more than the other alternatives. But I can't speak to that whatsoever. So that's the best.
Yeah, I think the kind of like first draft of it that I would have is you would essentially have like a predictive system, right? You would have a system that like gives a fairly good prediction of what would happen, and then you would have people propose like various weights to give on things to see like, here if we plug in like these factors and here is the output, and then you just vote on which outputs that you want. And these would be outputs that are like incredibly optimized, right? Essentially, it would be like literally asking like, which one of these things do you care about more? And then like optimally providing those things. And this is just like a very interesting, like, it's like the fringes of reality almost. It's like completing a video game and just like playing around in the post game where you have all sorts of like overpowered equipment.
I think it's really interesting. I will say one of the really interesting arguments that not my form of market socialism, but the form of market socialism that like the Lange-Lerner model supports is including in that process, not just voting on the outputs, but voting with your money, as it were, voting by which products do you buy, how much, and at what price. And the reason why that matters is because what people vote for is often not identical to what they actually want. I think that a stat which has always interested me, I guess, has somewhat boggled my mind, is that consistently Pew has found that for the past 40 years, a majority of Americans have thought that crime has increased. And that number is mostly uncorrelated with the actual changes in crime from year to year. It's like 60% of people think crime has gone up, as crime in reality since the 90s has dropped by about like 60% or something along those lines. And it's been flat for like about 10 years. So what the American people think they want and what the American people think is real is often very different than what is real. And so that's not necessarily just a problem with democracy. That's just a problem with like how the human brain works to some degree. And so you need some other mechanisms in addition to that of finding a way to convert what people actually believe, what they actually want, into what they actually do. So not disagreeing. I think there's in any like AI model, there has to be a role for direct democracy. Like, hey, how much education output do you want? Because you can't really let people choose how much education spending they want. But there also is a role for just directly like letting people buy stuff and then maybe letting the AI realize that food is actually really, really important. It would be nice if it didn't underproduce food, something like that.
Yeah, I think actually, before we get to this, I think that's actually one of the examples that I used with regards to crime of how this kind of information cliff works. It's actually a very good kind of construction for this, which is that people receive the level of crime as like the percentage of crime times the amount of information they consume. Like the likelihood that the piece of information is crime times the total amount of information.
And so
and when there is up. Like, yeah, really like the proxy for like every bad thing that gets disproportionate, like the proxy for like the perception of every bad thing increasing is the fact that it gets increasingly reported. And that is not just like reported, sorry, actually that's like a confusing term, because there's like reporting a crime to a police versus
like reporting in the
like
news, right?
Yeah. And I mean in this case I mean like something that gets like that gets on the news and that gets like shared. And this actually like, man, going back I've
often heard the human brain function, like the knowledge function, described as a search function, which basically asserts that things are about as likely as how often they've heard about them, which is like an incredibly stupid search function, but it worked well enough in the past that it survived. It just doesn't work for the modern world, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you have all sorts of things like confirmation bias, negativity bias that, yeah, maybe helped propagate like some level of biological fitness, but I don't know. It seems like it's causing some problems now.
Epistemic fitness is very different than biological fitness, unfortunately. A whole lot of our society would be very different were that not the case.
Indeed. I think there's still some baseline level of reasoning, of good faith, and of ability for people to get things done, as long as there's not like horrible life-ending mitigating factors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so on that kind of strange insertion of a note of optimism, glad to have you here. Do you want to give any information on where people can find you?
Sure. At this point, I would usually shout out that people should vote in an election, but as far as I'm aware, there's no important ones coming up unless you have found a way to time travel backwards to vote even more strongly for the Democratic candidates in Georgia, in which case I strongly encourage you to do so. You can find me. My name's Aiden. I run the YouTube's, Socialism Done Left. That's Socialism Done Left. You can find me on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. On YouTube, I usually put debates and long-form content. On Twitch, I do streams, which is often where I get some of that long-form content. And on Twitter, I debate and get very mad with people who are also very mad and much stupider than I am, because I'm very smart. The smartest, some would say. And thank you again for having me on.